This is me. I'm sitting next to my favorite grass species, Bluebunch wheatgrass, or Peace spicata, in the middle of a hillside in eastern Washington, with a facial expression somewhere between confused and excited. You might not be surprised if I told you that I'm an environmental studies biology major at Whitman College, considering that I just indicated that I voluntarily spend my free time sitting next to plants. I first became interested in Bluebunch wheatgrass my sophomore year in college. I realized I needed a summer internship, and there weren't a whole lot of options that were both going to pay my rent and also keep me excited about science. I saw that my advisor had posted a job opening for 2 research positions working in the Wallula Gap, an area about 45 minutes away from the college, and I knew that anything based around ecology wasn't going to be too bad. The place we were doing our research is called Spring Gulch, the Wallula Gap Biological Station, part of a large swath of land owned by Whitman and turned into an ecological field site used by some of the environmental studies classes. It used to be described as a shrub-steppe ecosystem because of the number of shrub species and the lack of trees, but with climate change, human activity, intensive agriculture, and everything else that's going on, it's more of an arid grassland. When I first went out to the field site, I wasn't entirely prepared for what my summer was going to be like. My internship partner and I were led out to the field site, deposited next to a topography plot, and given a crash course in Bluebunch wheatgrass identification. The demography plots are these 1 meter by 10 meter areas split into 10 squares and designated with poles of rusted spiky rebar that'll scratch you if you ever try and lean over them. The idea is that you can monitor the same plants year after year but not disrupt the habitat too much, so you still get an idea of what the plants would normally be doing if you weren't around. The plants are all tagged with aluminum tree tags, and using a system of a metal grid spread over the plots, you can sketch a quick map of where each plant is so that, in theory, you can easily find any specific plant next time you're at the plot. The first day, everything took forever. The first plot was on a north-facing slope, which means it was retaining slightly more moisture than the south-facing slopes and consequently had a large number of plants to survey. For the purpose of this video, it's going to be difficult for me to show you because unfortunately my field site burned down and a lot of the plants that would be there kind of aren't there anymore. As the summer progressed, I began to discover all sorts of things about myself in the grass I never would have imagined. For one thing, I actually enjoyed counting and measuring the plants. For each plant, we were recording the number of culms and the height of the tallest culm, as well as how many of the culms that we were counting had reproductive structures, which is known in grass language as spikes. And then from there, how many spikelets a small sample of these spikes had. This was originally both frustrating and monotonous, but I soon got into the rhythm of data collection, and I was legitimately surprised and actually kind of sad when the summer was over. I signed up for a second summer. For my second summer with the grass, the hillsides were obviously having a tough year. Previous students had constructed shade plots on 2 hillsides to observe the differences in seedling survival when plots were either covered or left uncovered. The covered plots tended to have more moisture, and the seedlings in these plots had unsurprisingly done a lot better than their exposed counterparts. But during the 2015 summer, I was surprised when we climbed up to the hillside to discover that almost every plant in the open plots had died, and even the shaded plots were having a tough time. Of the 275 seedlings we surveyed in 2014, only 74 survived. In other words, only 27% had made it from the previous year. Even in the demography plots, the dry summer was taking its toll on the Bluebunch. The plants began to go dormant weeks earlier than I'd previously observed, and almost every plant had shrunk from its previous size. It was at this point that I first began to consider how important moisture was for the survival of these plants. One of the first things you can see when you enter the Wallula Gap is how dry the south-facing hillsides are in comparison to the north-facing ones. This logically makes sense, as south-facing hillsides are receiving more direct sunlight and thereby losing more water more rapidly. You can also see that the species composition of the 2 sides differs considerably. Previous research suggested that the population of south-facing plants is smaller than the population of north-facing plants, but that south-facing plants have a higher reproductive output. After testing differences in seedling survival in the shade plots, which were meant to simulate north and south-facing conditions, previous students had concluded that these differences might be explained by differences in seedling establishment and survival due to soil moisture and possibly some cheatgrass competition. While it's clear that moisture is very likely the main driver of these differences between hillsides, a unrelated 30-year study at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in Idaho suggested that survival and growth trends had a more significant impact than seedling establishment on overall population growth for Bluebunch wheatgrass. In other words, they agreed that moisture was having the biggest impact, but they didn't believe it was having the biggest impact because of reproduction. Having read these 2 research conclusions, I was curious. What would happen if I compared the survival, growth, and reproduction of these 2 hillsides? Would they look the same or different? What if I modeled the entire population using the same method as the 30-year Idaho study and projected into the future? What would the populations look like? And what would the most important demographic trends be for the population's overall changes? Curious and slightly overconfident in my calculus abilities, I decided to find out. To answer these questions and make my model, I was going to need to determine survival, growth, and reproductive equations for the north and south-facing hillsides from 2012 to 2015, which was all the data available. I was also going to need to figure out how many seeds were produced on average by the plants on each hillside and how big those seedlings were when they were first counted. Based on literature and previous undergraduate theses, I decided that the best indicator of size was the number of culms. The model I wanted to use was an integral projection model, which attempts to combine all these variables together to create a mathematical landscape that lets you view the population in terms of size transitions. To start my model, I began with survival. Unsurprisingly, the survival rates of plants increased as the size increased. After Bluebunch reached about 75 culms, almost 100% of the plants were surviving to the next year on north-facing slopes. On the south-facing slopes, the overall trend was similar. Big plants tended to do better. The point where the survival rate reached 100% was a bit later, around 125 culms, but there was no mathematically significant difference between the two slopes equations. According to these equations, the survival of the plants on north and south-facing slopes really wasn't that different. The growth equations were a little bit less clear. For one thing, the majority of the plants appeared to be shrinking in size. The overall trend line for growth had a smaller slope than what you would expect for plants either staying the same size or growing larger. A similar pattern was going on for the south-facing population, but just like for survival, there was no mathematically significant difference between the two hillsides. I was surprised by this, but I pressed on. For reproduction, I needed to find multiple equations. First, I needed to calculate what the likelihood of a plant even producing seeds in a given year. For Bluebunch wheatgrass, this can be easily calculated by the likelihood of a plant having spikes. As previous student researchers suggested, south-facing plants did have a higher chance of producing spikes. Additional data analysis indicated that they also produced more seeds. A lot more seeds. This made sense from personal experience with the grass, but it was nice to see my suspicions validated by actual data analysis. I was also interested in the average size distributions of the two hillsides across the past few years so that I could see how they might change in the future. I used a probability density plot to see which percent of the population was what size. Since survival tends to increase with culm number, it was unsurprising that many of the south-facing plants were 40 culms or more, and that, overall, the median size for south-facing plants was larger than the median size of north-facing plants. Taking all this information into account, I began to make my model. This required using MATLAB, which has the capacity to be very useful if you're familiar with the program, and very complicated if you've never used it before, which unfortunately was me. But after some solid hours spent glaring at my computer screen, I crunched the numbers and produced this. This is my integral projection model. More specifically, this is my north-facing integral projection model, and it actually looks more like this when all the pretty colors are removed. The darker the color, the higher the kernel value is, which also means that it's more likely that that specific size transition will take place. See that dotted diagonal line? That's what we'd expect to see if all of the plants were surviving but staying the exact same size from year to year. Anything below that line means the plant is likely to grow. Anything above that line means the plant is either shrinking or dying off. As you can see, the north-facing population is doing a lot of shrinking. This was surprising to me. Remember how north-facing slopes are the ones with lots of plants on them and plenty of moisture? So if all the plants are shrinking, why? What's going on? There are a lot of possible answers. Some authors have suggested that bunch grasses tend to shrink to smaller sizes when stressed, possibly in an effort to use less energy and survive difficult conditions. Maybe all the additional competition on north-facing slopes is leading to each individual plant receiving low amounts of water, even if the hillside as a whole has plenty of water. Or perhaps in the process of making my model, something made the data a little skewed. 2015 was a very dry summer, and since the model only relies on 3 summers worth of data, you may be pulling the data to an extreme that's not really representative of the real population dynamics. Exactly what's going on here is unclear, but if the results are accurate, they're certainly concerning. I also created a south-facing integral projection model. This one looks surprisingly different considering that survival and growth weren't statistically different between the two hillsides. It seems that south-facing plants were still shrinking, but not as drastically. Again, all of the concerns with the north-facing model are still present, but it's possible that since south-facing plants tend to be larger, they may have deeper roots and be able to stand the shrinking moisture from a dry summer like 2015. However, even these plants appear to be shrinking, so the fate of this population is still very much up in the air. One thing that's great about these models is that you can use them to predict what the future might hold. More specifically, you can project the data into the future and predict the stable size distribution and size-based reproductive outputs. For north-facing slopes, the predicted stable size distribution indicates that the plants are going to get a lot smaller. This makes sense if you consider how many of the plants appear to be shrinking according to the integral projection model and the growth equations. For south-facing slopes, the predicted stable size distribution centers around plants with fewer than 50 culms, but you can see that this distribution is a little bit larger in general than north-facing. Essentially, the stable size distributions indicate that the size differences between hillsides that we've seen across the last 4 years will probably continue to remain different. Both hillsides will experience shrinkage. These predictions also include reproduction, which is represented as the dotted line in these graphs. Unsurprisingly, larger plants are predicted to contribute more seeds to the population overall. Additionally, south-facing plants will produce more spike/seeds than north-facing slopes, but we still don't know what the actual survival of these seeds will be for either slope. There's definitely an area of study that could use some more investigation. Finally, I wanted to know which of the demographic transitions, growth, reproduction, and/or survival, was the most important to focus on for conservation. I did this using elasticity analysis, which basically wiggles the parameters around a little bit to see how the overall population dynamics respond when one parameter increases. So for instance, if we increase growth rates a little bit, what's going to happen? The analysis ended up looking like this. Basically, we can see that there's a large value for plant transitions along the survival growth line for both north and south-facing plants. In other words, this indicates that if we want to try and conserve the species or increase the size of the overall population, we should focus on helping the plants continue to grow larger and also make sure they survive. If you think about it, this sort of makes sense, but in some ways it's kind of weird. See that strip at the top of the elasticity graph? That's reproduction. If you're wondering why it's so tiny, it's because new plants are tiny and therefore don't take up very much space on my graph. But if you look at the elasticity values, they're calculated as way lower than the values for growth and survival. It seems a little strange that reproduction has so little impact. If this is true, then why are the species compositions so different on the two hillsides if the survival and growth are supposedly not statistically different from one another according to the other equations that I've done? I don't have any perfect answers to these questions. I would love to spend more time out in the grass determining the exact amount of water received by each plant or simply collecting more data so that we have more information to go off of. I'm also interested in how these south-facing plants got so much larger than their north-facing buddies across the valley. I suggest that competition is probably involved, but I think studying it in more detail would definitely be worth doing. Though perhaps it seems like all I did was a lot of calculus to learn something I'd already suspected, which is that moisture appears to affect plants. I believe that my model was still worthwhile. As climate change continues to slowly creep northward and change so many parts of the world that we once thought were stable, we're going to want to know what to expect. We're going to need to know if the deer in this area will still have enough to eat in a few years, or if the livestock we care about will still be economically feasible when the native grasses start to die. We're going to have to start having fires every year because the ground is so dry year-round and so thickly covered with cheatgrass. And maybe this model didn't really answer any of these questions perfectly, but it made an attempt, and I think it shows that we really should start considering how climate change is going to affect ecosystems, both worldwide and right near home. We're going to want to know as much as we can about the world before it changes into something that might not even look the same. And though Bluebunch wheatgrass may seem small and seemingly unimportant, I believe that even by researching one small part of an ecosystem, we can learn a lot about how our world is changing around us, and maybe, if we're lucky, how we can restore some small part of it back to the way it was, or at least give it a better shot of holding up against some of the difficult times that we're going to see in the future. And as for me, even if I'm wrong and my results are just ridiculous, I don't consider these past 2 summers a waste. I learned more about the scientific research process than I ever have in a classroom. That's not useful. Oh my god. And I discovered how MATLAB worked, well, at least partially. Most importantly, I discovered a love for Bluebunch wheatgrass, and that makes everything else worth it.